Welcome to the course Literature of the Ancient Near East. I'm Dr. Justin Singleton. In this very first lecture, we're going to be talking about what literature actually is. And as we progress through the timeline of literary theories, I really don't want you to get bogged down in the many confusing ideologies. Just note that they exist, write down the name, and then maybe a one sentence meaning of what that theory is or does or teaches or however you want to put it. And I want you to also note that many of these theories are going to sound really weird to our modern ears. Now, I should note that every single one of these theories actually does have value. Each of them, even the really weird ones, they come from a certain perspective that we may or may not have thought of. And therefore, each of them can help build your own personal approach to literature. And you'll see that more of that toward the end of this lecture. Okay, well, while it may not be particularly obvious at first, there's actually a huge debate over what literature is. A first thought may be that anything written is literature, but that would include post-it notes and recipe cards, text messages, and even road signs. Is Shakespeare literature? Sure. Is poetry literature? Of course. What about the poem that an 8-year-old writes for her mother? Is that literature? Maybe not. But then does that mean that only some poetry is literature? If someone desires to study a given subject, it seems important to first define that subject. In order to define the subject, in this case, literature, one must be able to identify the elements that make it. Specifically, what makes it distinct from other systems. But how can we do this without first knowing what literature is and what it's not? Well, unfortunately, this can only be accomplished by analyzing the assumptions and interpretive functions that readers have historically assigned to the different texts that they have called literature. Now, the debate as to what is and is not literature, it isn't going to be resolved anytime soon. But the history of literary theory is quite revealing. Going back in time, before 1800, literature and related terms simply meant things written. Or it could be a reference to book learning. And even in academics today, if a professor asks you to give a literature review, that literature review refers to the review of written scholarly works on a specific topic. Well, after that point, there came a change in an understanding of what truly made writings literature. By the Romantic period, the idea of literature came to be equated explicitly with the imaginative, that is, fiction. This can be traced to German romanticists during the end of the 18th century, but more specifically to a French baroness by the name of Madame de Staël, whose book, On Literature Considered in Its Relations with Social Institutions, describes the imaginative literariness that's understood today. It was once believed that truly literary works refer not to historical individuals, but merely or only to imaginary ones, such as Huckleberry Finn and Emma Bovary. Even today, some describe the literary genre specifically as poetry, drama, or prose fiction. Now, interestingly, the literary critic David Masson, who was for a short time a contemporary with Charles Dickens, criticized Charles Dickens for risking the purity of his literature because Charles Dickens liked to polemicize and moralize in his works. That is, he liked to make his stories teach things. Well, David Masson believed that Charles Dickens was writing beyond the scope of true literature. Okay, this fictionality in literature was not limited merely to characters and events. the familiarizing features of a language that relate to utterances, adverbials discussing place and time, such as here, now, tomorrow, and even pronouns such as I or you function differently in literature. Now, in academic writing today, using these terms is often discouraged as the reader may or may not relate when the writer argues subjectively or emotionally. And this is stuff that you have most likely already heard. For instance, the statement, you should understand that, or even when I go there. These rather personal statements may cause an argument to lose its persuasiveness in an academic setting. The reader not wanting to be accused. What do you mean I should understand that? Why are you accusing me? Kind of pausing my notes here for a second, but I sometimes actually do that. Like when I'm reading, you should understand that. What? Why are you accusing me of something? Anyway, my little 2 cents being thrown in there. Okay. These rather personal statements may cause an argument to lose its persuasiveness in an academic setting. The reader not wanting to be accused or not caring where the author, the I, is going. When I go there, I don't care where you go. On the contrary, within fiction writing, the very subjectiveness of those statements is precisely called for. The reader does not understand these statements literally, of course. Rather, the reader understands the fictionality of the literary setting of the work. I does not refer to the writer, but to the fictional narrator, who may be altogether different from the author. These deictics, as they're called, utilize contextual parameters built into the fictional work. Thus, in fiction, the relationship between what the author believes and what the fictional speaker says depends on one's interpretation. Unfortunately, what is commonly detailed as literature, even at the time of Masson, includes far more than the imaginative, such as Francis Bacon's essays, John Donne's sermons, and the spiritual autobiography of John Bunyan, let alone the polemicizing of Dickens. The defining of literature simply as the imaginative just doesn't work in reality, especially as writing imaginatively includes texts that most people wouldn't consider to be literature, such as movie scripts or comic books. Another attempt to define literature stems from a movement toward what could be considered really good writing or fine writing, or belles lettres. Thus, Thomas Babington Macaulay, who wrote poetry about heroic deeds in Roman history, and Charles Lamb, the essayist and playwright, might act as examples of belles lettres with their beautiful and captivating styles. But Charles Darwin and Karl Marx, whose works were said to lack a sense of beauty in their verbiage, would not be considered literature at all. The essence of belles lettres was that it was a special kind of writing that was exemplary in its use of rhetoric and language, writing moving beyond mere fiction and including fine writing and perhaps therefore thinking. This includes in sermons, histories, speeches, and philosophies. The change is evident in the criticisms of Dickens, who, though wrote polemics and morals, was said to have an instinct for the beautiful. Even today, any textbook on British literature, French literature, or American literature does not include legal documents, scholarly writings, or telephone books, but rather includes artistic or aesthetic works, concluding the definition of the term literature by these additional adjectives, rather than the more etymological meaning of just something consisting of letters. By 1840, composition was seen as both a science and an art that included principles of sublimity and beauty. In 1880, Matthew Arnold, an Oxford academic, gave to poetry, and therefore literature, an almost sacred function, building upon the Romantic poets before him who had ascribed a rather visionary status to the genre, one that receded to the classics, giving literature something akin to special powers. To him, literature was a product of living in a high culture and could be thought of as the best of thoughts and language. Fine writing, although ambiguous, is that writing style that is highly regarded. Yet, if true literature is always understood to be exemplary writing, a natural product of living in the highest of cultures, why is there such a category as bad literature? I mean, shouldn't all literature, by nature of its beauty, be good? Interestingly, just as Charles Dickens was accused of risking literature by moving beyond simple imaginative writing, Jean-Paul Sartre, in more recent times, was accused of murdering literature by moving beyond belles lettres. In reality, the fall of belles lettres as a definition for literature dates back quite some time. 19th century literary criticism, being highly influenced by the belles lettres concept, had already began to create reasons why belles lettres couldn't work, namely informal aesthetic principles of rhetorical theory, basically making literature so extremely rigid as if a science. This approach both limited writing and moved literary criticism closer to a structuralist concept, separating belles lettres critique from the rhetorical foundations of belles lettres. Stopping my notes here for a second. Basically, what they did was they wanted to make literature more like mathematics, like 1 plus 1 equals 2. Well, if you use this and that, then it must be good literature. Making it I can't think of the word. Basically making it more science-like, like math. Okay, moving on. Yep, and apparently there was a button I was supposed to push somewhere. Apologies. During the early 20th century, particularly after the First World War, a new type of structuralist argument was made: Russian formalism. Seeking a more objective or scientific discussion of literary criticism, Russian formalists recognized the structural analysis of a text in an almost robotic way as the most important form of analysis, identifying how literature can be differentiated from non-literature writings through rigid form or feature. These literary forms somewhat continuing the belles lettres definition. Now, rather than a truly fine writing per belles lettres, the literary is understood to be an intensification of everyday speech, deviating systematically from ordinary language and drawing attention to itself by flaunting its material being, its substance. According to this theoretical approach, the writing of literature has no basis in ingenuity, imagination, or intuition, and the historical or sociological context bears little on our understanding of it. On the contrary, the literary critic, according to this theory, should approach the text as a completely independent entity. This dissociation of art from mystery concerned itself not with religion, psychology, or sociology, but rather with the organization or structure, thus structuralism, of language. Literature was not seen as a medium of ideology, but as a dissectable entity whose individual parts or words are completely devoid of meaning. All external context to the writing had no influence upon the text. Within Russian formalism, the text itself is of utmost importance, and verbal strategies create literariness, redirecting from the author of the work to the verbal devices within it, these being the true heroes of the text. For example, the work titled Don Quixote is not concerned with a character of the same name. Instead, the character in the story is simply the device that holds the differing narrative techniques and verbal devices together. So again, you can see how structured this idea is, how mathematical it is. In a similar vein, the theoretical approaches within the New Criticism movement of the American and British schools disregarded any and all authorial intention and emphasized literature as objects, utterly separate from the author, emphasizing the individual elements that create the unified structure of the work. Thus, external aspects of the work don't really matter that much. The student of literature merely focuses upon the text and discusses plot, symbols, irony, and other literary devices. The New Criticism of the 1930s and 40s created an enduring legacy that led to the formation of a plethora of additional theoretical perspectives. Beginning in the 1960s, these include phenomenology, psychoanalysis, linguistics, Marxism, feminism, and structuralism. Within phenomenology, there was the search for the unchanging essence of a thing, not in some weird abstract way, but rather the concreteness of an object within the world created by the author's consciousness and manifested throughout the author's work. Thus, within phenomenology, a green apple can be described by the very greenness of green, a thing that exists separate from all other things. Now, I'm sure at this point you can kind of understand why I said at the beginning, don't get bogged down in all this. Just try to get a basic understanding of it. Phenomenology boasted upon experiential evidences that could lead to genuine knowledge, like experimentation, experiential scientific approaches. The approach was understood as a science of phenomena. And like many other of these strategies, the philosophical discussions of literary phenomena continues today. Just as with New Criticism, within phenomenological criticism, historical context, authorial production, and even readership are disregarded in favor of a completely immanent or intrinsic reading of the text, though the reader's experience of this literary world tends to create that very world. As a reaction to such phenomenological arguments came structuralism. Here, the deep structure included rules, models, and grammar that existed in contrast to simple surface phenomena that could be considered accidental and variable. Structuralism utilized a linguistic strategy that interpreted literature as a concrete example of an abstract system, whereby the critic could break down the structure of the writing, explain the genre, identify the signs, and demonstrate both its semantic and syntactic aspects. More specifically, the theory concerned itself with the examination of the general laws by which structures existed. Rather than a phenomenological consciousness, structuralism searched for unconscious structures, such as those related to language, the psyche, and even unconscious structures within society. Because of this, structuralism led into other related theories, such as those in connection with psychoanalysis, putting to use the ideology behind Freudian unconsciousness, and even Marxist proposals. It should be noted that within the structuralist theories, literature was understood to be completely different from all other forms of language usage, existing as a non-pragmatic discourse. So not a normally used language. A non-pragmatic discourse within its own with its own grammatical regulations that may or may not be used in everyday speech. As one might suspect, the rigidity of the structuralist approaches effectuated a response, and although labeled differently depending upon the author, the differing post-structural methods stemming from a dissatisfaction with the paradigms all began from a critique of structuralism. Now, this is not to say that post-structuralists utterly reject all of structuralism, but rather they question the objectivity of structuralism. In fact, the movement accepts major tenets of structuralism, and within some models, post-structuralism is subsumed under structuralism, understood as both a continuation and a rejection of the latter. The post-structuralist movement can perhaps be better understood as a reorganization of the then defined structuralist school of thought, as theorists moved beyond the narrowly conceived structure of the theory. As theorists, they attempted to find common ground between functionalism, which emphasized ecology and economics, and high structuralism, which emphasized the rules of interpretation. Post-structuralists continued the structuralist fixation on language, but now literature is understood to be a self-referential form that has no relationship to reality outside of language itself. Thus, it separated itself from structuralism, and that the post-structural theoretical discourses critiqued the concept of objective knowledge. The text is understood to be comprised of a system of signs, language functioning through representation, where a mental image is manifested verbally. For example, the mental image of a tree, referred to as the signified, is verbally manifested as a signifier using a sequence of letters or sounds. In English, these being the letters T, R, E, E. In this belief, meaning is always absent from its sign. It's never fully present and is in a constant state of flux as words change and concepts expand. Think of the word gay. Since this signifying system is constantly changing within a society, post-structuralists recognize that any complete description of the system is an impossibility. And since cultural phenomena is understood to be unintelligible, the emphasis is instead placed upon the critique of knowledge itself. The approach became an interpretive discipline, allowing for very many different interpretations and meanings of a single data set. As such, it's given way to new disciplines, contemporary versions of feminism, psychoanalysis, Marxism, and historicism. Because of this, there is an attempt to open the door to alternative voices and new avenues of discussion, seeking explanations for systemic relationships, finding meaning from the perspective of the actor, and exposing ideological structures. Now, of the multiple past theories, there are strengths and weaknesses. And rather than a rejection or a replacement of the facets of the previous theory, each theory built upon the former to advance in understanding, and each brought a greater sophistication and even real-world relevance to the interpretation. In the new millennium, the war between these differing theories has seemingly come to an end. But while terms such as structural or post-structural are no longer emphasized, tenets of those former theories carry over into today. So again, the past theories, everything we just went through, there really are no people who hold those theories today. But note how they built upon each other. And now, even though people say that there are no more theories, there are obviously more theories. That's what I'm getting into now. I don't want to jump ahead of myself. Okay, Although there has been a call to free oneself from any one theoretical position, there still exist theoretical frameworks from which current scholars practice their views. Three of the more common amongst these current theories are new materialism, which is primarily an ontological approach, and intersectionality, which is primarily a political move away from Western-oriented philosophies, and a philosophical pragmatism, which is a move away from excessively abstract formulations. One current theoretical approach to interpretation involves things. This new materialism has been nomenclated with various titles, often including the term turn, such as the ontological turn or the turn to things, and includes several approaches such as vitalism, actor network theory, and object-oriented ontology. As a theory, this borrows heavily from post-structural thought. Post-structuralists say text, but materialists say matter. But new materialism is distinguished in that it rejects the emphasis on human exceptionalism. That is, things are merely material symbols of culture. It rejects that. Instead, the philosophical move is toward placing things at center stage, where things have their own existence that transcends a human-object correlation. Thus, when approaching a text, one must begin with the concept of non-human agency, dismissing our individual or collective subjectivity and the human-oriented agency that humans possess. Therefore, this turn is a search for the underlying character of entities in the world, human or not, and the relational nature of reality itself. While the differing approaches within this theory are not uniform, they all share the starting point of ridding oneself of Western dualistic thoughts. It includes a rejection of classical humanist dichotomies such as culture versus nature, human versus animal. Rather than differing cultural beliefs about one material world, which is understood as a Western colonization of the past, in this view, differing things inhabit differing worlds with multiple ontologies. Thus, the concept is such that the modern Western scholar must be capable of stepping away from his or her Western mindset and be open to other truths, rather than silence or disregard other ontologies that may exist. New materialism is both anti-theoretical and anti-methodical, these relating to human agency. This humanization of things leads to questions of correlationism. Specifically, since human minds of whatever people group order raw data, within this perspective, it's possible to understand the world outside of our own correlation with it. Excuse me, that was a question. Is it possible to understand the world outside of our own correlation with it? The answer within new materialism is yes, but through speculation. Speculative realism is this attempt to speculate beyond human limits, or human-object correlation. By that I mean how things relate to humans. Since speculative realism attempts to theorize beyond this, it's an attempt to understand something beyond the phenomenal world. This is possible because within reality there is no single fundamental correlation between things, but rather numerous relations. These things remain withdrawn relationally and may be inaccessible to human interpretation without the aid of non-human perceivers. Thus, other things help the theorists understand the thing studied, which is to say that the relations between the thing studied and the other thing may be understood through human other thing relations. These things within literature not being limited to the text itself. According to this theory, the practitioner must be careful. Seeking to speculate about a thing within its own ontology, which you're supposed to do, can be difficult, as attempting to adopt the object's ontology may reinstate a different dichotomy, colonially abducting its reality. Moving on, the foundational principle of intersectionality is to understand the past and the present, often through lenses unfamiliar to many. Since the 1980s, it was known that understanding the past is wrapped in contemporary concerns, including social, cultural, and political. And this became increasingly realized with diverse contributions to the humanities, whether theoretical or actual. The origins of most literature studied today, and in fact the origins of scholarship of those works, is that of the white European man. But as scholarship is no longer merely performed by white European men, a renewed interest in the politics of literary theory have been generated. With the general call to diversify knowledge sets within academia, for some, engagement in diversification became a necessity that, whether desired or not, resulted in embracement. This embrace eventually welcomed the intersection of marginalized people into well-established fields, which today includes not only differing colors of skin, but also disabilities, sexual orientation, economic status, and more. The results of such an endeavor came through the multiplicity of interpretations via perspectives that may not be considered normal to many in the discipline, including a feminist and queer theory, indigenous perspectives, gender theories, and others from minoritized backgrounds. Thus, interpretations based on beliefs other than Western thought bring new perspectives to the table, giving an equity where previously there was inequity. The final of the three modern theories, pragmatism, in general concerns the theory of meaning. And although not a unified field, this distinct American philosophy generally holds that meaning is determined by the practical consequences of an idea or action. The study of the ancients utilizes logical reasoning in order to give meaning to the object of study, no matter the theoretical practices followed. But pragmatists remain leery of excessively abstract formulations that have no real-world application. As such, pragmatists reject the idea that philosophical insight can lead to unchangeable foundations to knowledge, such as dogmatic beliefs, since, after all, humans are fallible. And according to pragmatists, knowledge is humanly conditioned. Instead, the focus of pragmatism has been on the science of signs, or semiotics, which has opened new paths to empirical study. Now, this is not to say that a search for signs is a search for an arbitrary, disembodied mental association. Instead, pragmatists believe that the significative meaning of objects can be physically apparent in qualitative ways. So it's kind of going back to the sciencey stuff, to the mathematical stuff. In other words, they search for signs rather than symbols. Thus, the philosophy of pragmatism in literary studies concerning ancient cultures involves a practical understanding of those past cultures and their literature, where the meaning of signs can be determined through the consequences of past actions. The inherent implication of pragmatic semiosis is that it's a process. As such, it incorporates deductive and inductive, but also abduction, deduction and induction, but also abduction, which is a combination of the two. Rather than simply deducting based on premises or inducting based on empirical evidences, abduction allows for postulation concerning the causes of things observed. Pragmatism is the process of reasoning that fixes the meaning of abstract ideas to concrete experiences, and therefore offers a path beyond unrestrained idealism and unrestrained empiricism. It's an attempt to mediate between the differing approaches, and therefore, if pragmatism offers nothing else, according to pragmatists, it should give rise to clarity. Most scholars do not conform to any one theory. Instead, scholars combine methods and theories in which they've come into contact. Having come into contact with many different theoretical approaches, the student, through logical inference of cross-theoretical contact, creates his own theory, building upon those of the past. And that's what I want you to do. Structuralism is enticing due to its empirical approach. It'd be nice if everything fit so well into black and white boxes. Unfortunately, unrestrained empiricism is quite lacking. If empiricism is observation and repetition through experimentation, then literary criticism cannot be empirical, unless one chooses to dismiss authorial intention and context. One can understand why post-structuralism was a necessary counter-theory to structuralism, specifically the questioning of the objectivity of empiricism. And while post-structuralism was not the result of a complete paradigm shift from one science to another, there were key differences in the theoretical approaches. Post-structuralism rejects the concept that literary theory is merely a science and embraces inquiry into symbols, identity, and multiple meanings. And it rehumanized studies, allowing for a recapturing of distinctive human qualities. While one can commend the strive to interpret through both materialist and idealist positions, the allowance of multiple valid interpretations based on a single data set becomes confusing, especially the promoting of a relativistic and unknowable past. The same can be said of the new materialism. The reliance on metaphysical philosophy makes the theory somewhat incomprehensible. Additionally, the ahumanization, the dehumanizing really, of objects has led to the dehumanizing of the subject of study. The intersectionality of differing perspectives humanizes the past. Truly, one may have a deeper insight than another into an interpretation of differing actions, depending upon the life experiences of the one, including sex, economic status, race, culture, and whatever else. And intersectionality has successfully represented the fluidity of power and identity dynamics, even to the point of introducing queer perspectives that had been taboo beforehand. Ultimately, research is marred by accusations of racism, sexism, and so forth, which are sometimes true, but do nothing to bring unity to the discipline. Rather than the open perspective of marginalized and minoritized individuals, the approach often dismisses everything but these individuals, making the theory itself unusable as a theory. It's perhaps the pragmatic approach that's most appealing, though it too has its problems. Pragmatism includes both empiricism and idealism, but attempts to restrain the two through logical perspective, including inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning in order to postulate causes and effects. While the propensity of the theory to dismiss determinations may lead to charges of hyperrelativism, this can be remedied by the assertion that some things actually can be known, which you and I agree to. One of these knowable concepts is that humans create for a reason. Contrary to past theoretical beliefs, people are not a product of their circumstances, but are in fact contributors to them. Obviously, humanity, and therefore the works of humanity, are embedded in social, cultural, ideological, and material relationships that we can refer to as context. But the dispute over agency is important to the debate. An agent is someone who has free will. Thus, the question of agency is asking to what extent humans are responsible for their own actions. Some scholars believe that humans are guided by the natural world around them and therefore have no true free will. They may react to the forces upon them, but they are utterly helpless to them. For others, there is a sense in which human agency includes both free will and a determined future. In reality, it can be argued that humans make choices not determined by their context, but within their context: social, cultural, ideological, and material. More clearly stated, choices are susceptible to context. But rather than the context determining ideas and behaviors are determined on the individual level. Individuals and their households producing or creating the societal context and not the other way around. So, in a nutshell, what I just said was every household or every individual works together to create the society, and the society does not create new individuals. Within societies are social ideals that represent the society, often referred to as a social identity. These being taxonomical categorizations that separate a society from other societies. These ideals are naturally reproduced within a society through a process referred to as social reproduction, which is the reinforcing of proper ideas and behaviors, at least according to those people. Many of these social reproductive strategies are unconscious since individuals within a society tend to just mimic those around them, particularly children to their parents. Of course, conflict often arises within a community, and because the range of conflict may be simple or devastating, social reproduction is an obvious conclusion, is not an obvious conclusion, but an ever changing reaction that shapes the individual and the society as a whole, sometimes even being purposefully introduced, as in the case of establishing law codes or rules within a society. Many forms of literature appear to have social reproductive and a social reproductive objective. Sorry. While not all literature deals with moral or polemical concepts, authors, through their writing, attempt to move their audiences. Generally speaking, an author persuades, records, and conveys ideas and information, or as Cicero stated, to teach, to delight, and to persuade. The 16th century critic Sir Philip Sidney noted that literature both educated and entertained the readers, exalting literature above history and philosophy. This is noted when one scholar refers to a society's literature as the noise of that society, but also its information. Literature has the potential to dignify and enculture a society. Within ancient literature, this is especially so, notably in the case of ancient epics, myths, and legal texts, where religious belief is directly tied into epics and myths, and where legal texts candidly discourage violations of cultural conventions. Other ancient genres also encourage the reproduction of societal beliefs, including treaties, which include factors of social identification. Historical texts, which very often direct the reader's viewpoint through the use of hyperbolic language, and even letters and poems, where the author attempts to move the intended audience toward his perspective. Ultimately, ancient literature should be understood to be reproducing one's culture in the next generation, whether directly or indirectly intended. I know this has been a difficult lecture, but again, I don't want you to get bogged down in it. This is all extremely fascinating stuff, and you can just follow rabbit trails forever. So don't do that. But I hope you enjoyed the lecture nonetheless. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to me.